Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You. I'm your host, Aditi Kumar, and today I have the opportunity to bring to you a very special guest, Willy Boulter. Willy is an experienced airline executive who has worked for over 40 years in various airlines around the world, living in 12 different countries along the way. He retired as the Chief Commercial Officer from Indigo Airlines in July 2022, and since then, he has consulted for a variety of organizations, including airlines in Hong Kong, the Middle East, and Uzbekistan. He continues to be very active in the industry, splitting his time between the UK, Japan, and wherever else his assignments take him. A couple of more interesting facts about Willie. He's a cricket lover and has recently published a book on his cricket club, the Stragglers of Asia, which was very interestingly founded in India about 100 years ago. So, Willie, we would love to know more about it as we progress in the conversation.
Sure.
His links to India actually go back to his late father, who served with the Indian Army during the Second World War. Willie is married to a Japanese Italian, Katerina, and they have three grown children. So, welcome, Willie. It's such a joy to host you today.
Thank you very much, Aditi. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you from Yokohama. Yeah.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And Willie, we've had a couple of quick briefings, but before we get started, I just want to quickly share that, which I tell all my guests, a little bit of my day job, which is executive coaching and leadership development. It sneaks into my conversations here. I have been fascinated by the inner landscape of accomplished leaders. And, while the world witnesses their external milestones, I've always been drawn to know a little bit more about what were their inner journeys like while they were going about achieving those milestones. So, even for today's conversation, that's the trajectory that I plan to take. And how does that sound to you?
Yep, that's absolutely fine, Aditi. No problem.
Great, great. Super. So, I want to start with, the vast length and breadth of experience that you've had, many, many, many years of experience behind you. You've spent over 4 decades in the airline industry. When you first entered the industry, what drew you to it? And what did leadership mean to you back then?
Well, I was fortunate enough out of university that I basically was selected as one of the management trainees for a British company in Hong Kong called John Swire and Sons, or Swire Pacific, as the listed entity is known. And they have a pretty diversified business in Hong Kong, which includes management control of Cathay Pacific Airways, which of course is Hong Kong's airline. So, I didn't actively go out to seek a position in the airline business, but they put me into the airline business as opposed to shipping or property or one of their other big industries. So that's how I ended up in the airline business. And I guess at that time, I was fortunate in that I had some experience of leading in a minor way. I'd actually served in the British Army as a very junior officer for about a year, just less than a year, regular as it were. And then for 3 years at university, I did it part time because I enjoyed it, and soldiering appealed to me, spending time outside, and they paid me for it for the days I did. So I learned a little bit of, I think, about leadership then. But what I realized, I think, when I went into sort of non-military life or civilian life in a firm is that, in the military, leadership has certain codes and certain processes which have been refined over many, many decades. And which are obviously designed to bring, results in very stressful and testing conditions. And as a result, those codes of leadership are, extremely effective. And you don't need to say anything twice, I would say, in the army. And if you do need to say something twice, that means it's very, very, very important. So I think that was my first adjustment, if you like, that I joined a civilian company and I realized that actually leadership is more, there isn't the sort of same code or the same processes and very highly developed sort of communication of orders and so on, which you get in the military. So I think that was my first adjustment. That when you're out of uniform, it is quite different.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So what I'm hearing you say is that so first that airline wasn't like your first choice as such. It was one of the things that came to you. But then,
Yeah.
of course, I mean, we have enough evidence to say that that grew on you in a way that it sort of became the next 4 decades became about it, right?
Yes.
It's very interesting, right? Like though it wasn't the first choice that you made, but the fact that it came to you and the relationship that you were able to develop with it, and also this bit about that how the leadership skills probably started with your experience in military, but how you had to probably adapt and flex yourself as you moved into the non-military positions as well, because probably influencing or persuasion or probably saying things more than once was super important if you're not
Yeah.
in the uniform. So somewhere that's what I'm sensing that though the
Yeah.
leadership initiation was through military, but then you did find yourself make and adapt very quickly to the demands
Yes.
of your later
Yes,
roles.
indeed. And I think, airlines actually are quite stressful businesses, and there's a lot that you can't
Yes.
control. Everything from fuel prices to weather to terrorist incidents, whatever it might be. There's a great deal in the airline business you can't control, and as a result, it is a very exciting um, sort of business to be in. And as a junior manager, I think that sort of appealed to me because although it wasn't as well, it wasn't a matter of sort of life and death. I'm not saying I was never in combat with the army, but you're training for those sorts of issues, and the airline is not as stressful as that. But having said that, it's a place where leadership is important and it's 24/7 a lot of the time, and it is an exciting business to work in. It's very different, I think, to say a manufacturing company or even a bank or something. I mean, it's far more sort of hands-on, and you have teams of people um, working alongside you, and you need to you need to influence and you need to persuade, and you need to give them motivation to keep going a lot of the time, especially when you're dealing as a junior manager at the front line at airports in particular. It does require, I think, fairly, it takes good leadership, and I'm not claiming I had it. In fact, some of my you know younger peers at the time probably thought I was a terrible manager because you know it takes you it takes you time to learn these things, and I'm not sure even after 3 4 decades I really learned it that well. But I think by the end of my career, my full-time career, I did understand how to manage groups of people. So yeah, but it's a long it's a
Yeah.
long process, and you have to
Yeah.
learn and make mistakes and so on. Yeah,
No, of course, Billy. And, I kind of resonate with the way you're describing the airline industry because the brief experience that I had, which was for about 2.5 years, I absolutely saw how this is an industry which is always live. You're always on the go, right?
yeah,
And I think even the bit that you said about being able to perform work, manage under pressure, under extreme stress, pressure. I think even those I see parallels between those and your role at the airlines, how you would have drawn from that experience as well back in the military and then in the airlines. That even in high stress environments, you need to take decisions, you need to think on your feet, you need to motivate people, and so on.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
that's
And
that's
I
that's
think I think, and that's why I would always in my team, if there was an opportunity, I'd always take somebody, from the services because I do think even in other countries, you get the same you get that same kind of quality of experience in people who've served in uniform for a while. I'm not saying it's a be all, the end all at all, and you can, obviously there are good people and bad people serving in the military as there are anywhere else, and so I don't think it's it's a given that you're going to get good leaders, but they will generally have. I think the thing that I most admire is that they don't get stressed in the same way that people who haven't seen anything beyond sort of normal business life, they don't understand. I mean, normal business life, even in the stresses and strains of, a company losing money and, constant sort of worry. I don't think it really is that stressful. I think, at the
Yeah,
end of the
yeah,
day, people get
yeah.
on. Yeah,
In fact, if I may, I'm just sharing like my brief experience of working with you at, back in the day. You would
yeah,
always have this very calm, cheerful disposition. And even if like there was lots going on, which was, in the external environment, there may be lots of ups and downs, but every interaction with you was like, hey, like there is some calmness. There is like, okay, so it's also almost like coming from a place that, yeah, this is something that happens every day. You go through
yeah,
ups and downs, but it needn't really affect your interaction with everyone. So the way
exactly.
you brought that together, I think for me that was something that I feel that I have learned, and I'm sure that
Yeah,
there are others who would speak for that. But thank you for sharing that, Billy. And that brings me to my next question, actually. That like when we start out in our careers, etc., we always have this notion that this is what doing good looks like, or this is what constitutes a good performance. That hey, if I'm doing this, that means I'm doing well. So two questions here. When you started out, what was it for you? Like, what were the parameters that hey, if I'm doing this, that means I'm doing well for myself? And how did that change over the years? Did it get redefined? Did new parameters get introduced? So if you could just tell me a
yeah.
little bit about that.
Well, I think, yeah, to start with, I mean, the parameters probably like a lot of young um, managers, you look to the sort of hard evidence of doing well. And so in the commercial airline world, that was, whether you were achieving the revenue targets in terms of passenger and cargo targets that would be set to you, once a year for the budget and so on. And that was something, hard and firm you could sort of touch and feel, and you'd get an update every month how you're doing, and so it was relatively easy to sort of measure success, if you like. But of course, there's a lot of other factors that come into it, and sometimes, as I learned over time, success in those sort of factors was purely a matter of luck in many cases, where you might be working in a market which was very strong, and where, of course, you think that you're producing the results yourself with your teams, but actually the market is driving probably 95% of those results, and equally the same applies when you might be in a very negative market environment where it doesn't necessarily mean that you're failing as a manager. In fact, dealing with adversity is obviously a quality that you need to develop. And so I would say that probably those hard sort of parameters, which as a younger man you want to sort of latch onto and you want to track, are probably not as important as you think they are. And people, I think, are looking for something much more. Now, there it gets difficult to define exactly what it is. But when I look at my own career against others, I sometimes think, well, how come this other guy did so much better? As chairman of an airline or two or whatever. And it's hard to to define, exactly what that success is. But I think as I got older, I sort of understood that actually I could, I could achieve my goals simply through motivating my team and having the right team around me. And those sort of people decisions became far more important in my mind than sort of worrying about whether we'd made last month's target or not. And I would say that took me a while to sort of understand. But very much by the time I was at Indigo, that was pretty much, I wouldn't say my only focus, but I was very focused on the team and the people, and I'd realized, if you like, I mean, I'd sort of taken lessons from John Adair, who actually died, I think, quite recently, but he was one of the first sort of leadership gurus, if you like, and he had this model of team, task, and individual, and those are the three areas you have to manage, and the task, which all the younger people tend to be focused on. A task is actually, the least important out of those. And if you're managing your team right, and then you're managing the individuals in that team, then you won't go too far wrong.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that pretty much covers, it sounds very simple, but for a manager to be able to do that constantly at any point in time, to have these three parameters sort of converging
Yeah.
in sync, in tandem, that's quite a bit. It's not an
Yes.
easy, you're making it sound very simple, but I just want to acknowledge that it's or probably over a period of time you master the art of creating having all the three elements in balance, but to be able to achieve that at any given point in time, even in stressful situations, I feel that that's quite a feat. And
Yes.
also this bit that you said, Willie, about at any point in time, being able to even in any situation, whether it's a big achievement or whether it is something that is pulling you down, whether it's a positive or a negative, which has happened, even at that point in time, to have the discernment that hey, it's not just one factor which is at play,
Yeah.
and therefore I feel that even as a team leader or a mentor, uh, this quality would come in really handy, right? Like your team members probably would, I would say that more than you, your team members would benefit from it. That, probably here's a manager who is not running me down for something which has not gone well, but is able to
Yeah.
bring the perspective that, hey, there could be many things at play. But at the same time, it's not that you're completely letting the person slack on the task. So,
Right. Yeah.
keeping that whole perspective going. So, yeah, no,
Yes.
so that was a very interesting way of looking at it. And thank you for taking us through that kind of a landscape that probably when you started out, tasks were more important, but slowly
Yeah.
the elements of individuals and teams also kept getting added, and each one of them ended up having probably equal importance towards your last full-time role. Um,
Yes. I mean, I
so,
think I just added one more thing on that, which is that, of course, for the people that you are reporting to in any organization, they will always focus on the task.
mhm,
They will very
mhm,
rarely focus on, your issues around your team or the individuals in that team. And so that's how naturally people focus on tasks because their masters are saying, we need this to be done. But it's always important to remember you're not going to achieve that, just by worrying about that task. You've got to worry
yeah,
about,
yeah.
have you got the individuals? Have you got the team working properly? So yeah, to me, it's a very, very important principle, and one, that those three legs, if you like, which hasn't really, in my experience, been bettered. I mean, I've read, plenty of leadership, and sort of books or whatever, and certainly had training, over the decades. But those principle, that John Adair principle, to me is rarely better. I haven't seen it. Well, is never better. I haven't seen anything to take me away from that. Something better.
Sure, sure. So, while we are on that, while we have kind of till this in this conversation, we have nailed a little bit of the framework that works for you. And it looks like it actually feels that maybe it's achievable to hold or create that ever elusive balance in which happens in people management. But with that, another question that comes to mind is that, hey, there might have been situations which would have been tricky as well, right? There might be, in your extensive span, there might have been situations where you might have faced conflict, or you would have felt conflicted about, which way to choose, some dilemma where, something that you hold very close as a value and something else that the external environment demands. Did you ever face such a conflict where you had to, like really pause and realign? The decision didn't really flow and you had to take a step back and come back to it. So does something come to mind in terms of a conflict, and how did you deal with it? Like, what took you to the other side of it, of the conflict?
Yes. I mean, there are many situations, I suppose, if I think through them, that would come into that um, sort of category. But I guess one that comes to mind right now is just during a strike, which Cathay Pacific had back in the early 90s, a cabin crew strike where the cabin crew, virtually 90% of them were on strike. And so we could operate only a very few flights. And I was one of the so-called situation managers. I was basically overlooking the operations of the airline. And so I wasn't dealing with the strike or dealing with the reasons for it. I was just sort of one of the three guys. We each worked sort of 8 hours out of 24. And we had to basically make decisions on which aircraft we would operate, which routes we would operate with the limited number of crew we had, which flights we would charter in from other airlines, and which flights we would cancel, and so on. And in that very sort of stressful situation, as I say, from a business point of view, although I think my military training again had sort of conditioned me for making those, because the important thing in those situations is to make decisions, is not to sort of hum and ha and expect perfect information the whole time. You've got deadlines, you've just got to get on. You've got passengers waiting, you've got cargo waiting to go. You have to make decisions. And I just remember, going through a very stressful day and achieving, what I thought was my tasks, and working with the people who were a lot of them were operational people. So we had management pilots who were helping me out, and then we had engineers, and we had a number of people sort of working in the ad hoc team to handle the airline. But I remember one of my bosses coming in, and in fact, my boss, and at the end of the day, we had achieved what I thought was our task, but we had a few crew who were willing to fly who hadn't flown. And he came in and he tore me off a strip and said, you shouldn't have left these crew at the end of the day. They came into work and now we have to send them home, and they'll be disappointed, and whatever. And I said, yes, but we got the customers away. Anyway, that sort of incident, it wasn't something. It left a big sort of impression on me that it was a total lack of motivation on his part, if you like, and it showed me that you've got to be consistent, because he, having sort of done that, then a week later or whatever, sent a huge bunch of flowers to my wife saying, "Oh, sorry, Willy's been away from home for the last couple of weeks," and blah blah blah, and which was very kind and great. But I just took that as a big sort of signal to me that in my leadership, you've got to be consistent. You can't, you can't sort of change spots, so much, and without really understanding what your team is going through. Because it was that team, we'd worked 8-10 hours, whatever it was, dispatching aircraft all day, and making some decisions which in retrospect were the wrong decisions, but at the time was the right thing to do. And that one sort of experience in a very, by airline terms, a very stressful sort of environment. That sort of interaction taught me a lot. And it's so important to be consistent in your tone when you're talking to people. Anyway, I'm not sure if that answers your question correctly, but it's just one thing
Yeah.
that weighed on me for a long time.
Yeah. No, sure, Willie. And the fact that you thought of this definitely also indicates that this is definitely one of those things that has stayed with you, and probably you have drawn from it later in life as well, or it would have influenced
Yeah,
probably some sort of, the way you show up as a leader, your decision making in tricky situations and so on. But what I'm really taking away is also the fact that uh, with a longer lens, you're saying that maybe it was not the best decision. But if you were to zoom in closer and see that in terms of the people who were involved, you still, even at that point in time, you still maintained a very consistent tone. The messaging was consistent. They, at any
yeah,
point in time, wouldn't have felt abandoned, that, hey, like my leader has just
yeah,
left me and
yeah,
gone away. So you took them along, even if it was a tough spot that you were in, but
yeah, yeah,
making sure to take them along. Because look, I mean, even in the work I do, there are a lot of times we keep talking about this, that take people along. It's very easy to say that when things are going fine. It becomes
yes,
difficult when things are not going fine. Then how do you take people along? So for me, this particular incident is kind of also shows me that what you truly believe in also gets manifested in probably the toughest of times, or maybe stressful, when stressful decision making is required. So maybe this is also something which is extremely embedded in you. This is something which is a part of your value system. This is something that you truly believe in, and so on. And
yeah.
in fact,
I think like, again, I would sort of point to maybe my brief military experience in the sense that the army teaches you, and I know the Indian army more than anyone, I think, has this ethic and this culture that you look after your people first before you
yeah,
look after yourself.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's
yeah,
very evident. And certainly in my years in India, when I came across Indian Army officers and so on, and Air Force officers, they all had exactly the same
yeah,
ethic in that sense that we used to in the British Army. So again, I don't want to sort of over stress them that sort of brief, you know, experience I had, but coming from a military family as well, I think that had some influence on me. And
sure,
and
sure.
my father, was a very a highly decorated soldier from the Second World War, but equally a very modest man. And he believed very much in that ethic of looking after your men before you worried about yourself.
Yeah,
And he
yeah,
fought not just the Second World War; he fought in Korea, and he was involved in campaign in Malaysia, and then he
yeah,
was even down in the Congo with the UN. So he saw a lot of action, and I think had and again another, but just sort of on the same theme. I mean, another important aspect of leadership, I think, and in those stressful situations, is having a sense of humor, if you like, or you know, making the team understand that yes, what we're doing is critical and important right at the moment, but it's part of life. There's maybe a broader environment not to lose sight of, and I think again, this is what points me against sort of micromanaging, that too many leaders get into micromanagement, and what they have to understand is that yes, you will never have the job done as perfectly, as you want it, as you would do it yourself.
mm-hmm.
But that's part of leadership, is to get the job done. You've got to delegate, and you've got to, be prepared to see things done, maybe not 100% the way you would have done it, but done in order to
Yeah.
achieve the task, and done by a motivated individual, a motivated team. And that is very rewarding when that happens. much more rewarding than working 24 hours a day checking up on everyone.
Yeah, yeah, no, sure, sure, absolutely, absolutely. Absolutely, Willie. And, our conversations have always been really long, and I have thoroughly enjoyed them over the years as well. But today, in the interest of time, I have one last question for you.
Yeah.
Given that you worked and lived in so many countries across the globe, I've always been very curious to know that what does it evoke in you when I were to, let's say, ask you that. Where do you belong, Willie? Where are you from? What's the sense of identity that you carry with yourself? So yes, talk a little bit about that, and that would be great.
Yes, well, I suppose it's become a bit unfashionable in the last, few years, to sort of claim to be a citizen of the world, or, somebody whose national ties, if you like, are maybe not as strong, as other people think they should be. And, I'm very proud of being British, and I don't have an issue with it. But at the same time, I think having worked in 12 different countries, as you mentioned, and lived in others, and obviously being married to someone of a different culture, I think it does sort of inform you, and it does give you a perspective on life, which you don't get if you're sort of just born and raised in one country. And I was just thinking about it yesterday. That there's a number of, in fact, my own local member of parliament was one of the people sanctioned by the Chinese because he said some very anti-Chinese things um, recently, and he was then, as a result of talks, he's now been unsanctioned, if you like. Um, but I do wonder if he's ever been to China. And I keep meaning to ask him, because I think a lot of the sort of stresses and strains between nations is caused by ignorance fundamentally. And if that's why I've been delighted to be part of an industry that is, as I think one of the leaders said, is a force for good. The airline business, by through its huge growth over the last decades, has brought people closer together and will continue to do so. Whether it does enough to, bring world peace is another thing entirely. But I do think, and it certainly from my own point of view, I am I think, very tolerant towards other people of other cultures or other nations, and I understand and have a lot of respect for people who come from much less privileged backgrounds than I do. And when you work in India or you work in Africa, in difficult countries, you just have to admire the spirit of people, and that's probably the thing that I really focus on is just how fantastic it is to see people with far less advantages than I had, and still in the struggle of life get on and achieve.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So like somewhere, so you were like the global citizen of the world even before it became fashionable. I think you were one of those early ones who were actually living a very, very global. You had a global exposure, and you were the global citizen.
Yeah,
That's that's
I mean, I
what,
guess, yeah,
yeah,
for,
that's
for
what I take
my
away.
my father, because I was born in
Yes.
Singapore actually, and in one of it during one of their postings. So and my mother also came from a military family, so she as well
Yeah.
had knew the world better than
Yeah.
most. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's very valuable, I think.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely, Willie. And before we wrap up, just would love to know your thoughts. How was this conversation for you? Were there some
Oh,
insights you had? So
yeah,
just
no,
talk a
it's
little bit
great.
about your experience of this conversation.
Well, I always enjoy talking about leadership, and obviously reflecting on my own sort of journey of my own career. And yeah, as I said, I think it does take time to sort of mature as a manager as a person. But it is equally extremely rewarding when you do feel that no one ever masters it, I think, but when you have the privilege of leading people, it is it's a very special thing, and yeah. I just hope that people who are under me don't sort of follow me out of curiosity, as somebody said about a junior officer once. This man, people will follow out of curiosity. I hope that they have more confidence than that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think this seems to be, for me, I'm taking this particular conversation away as part one. I think there is so much more to talk about, left to talk about. You as in your author avatar, you as a globetrotter. I think there is so much more to discover about you. Probably another round of conversation would be more than welcome. And for that, we would be very soon be back in touch with you. But thank you so much for spending time with us today and sharing your valuable life experiences with us. I think it's going to be a lot of value for our viewers. So thank you very much, Willy. Thank you for being with us today.
No, thank you, Aditi. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.